what, he's doing Enterprise already? Here's the thing about Enterprise. I think Enterprise gets a really bad reputation for no reason. Like, it's not perfect, it's definitely lower on the scale when it comes to all the shows, but you gotta take into account the fact that Enterprise was put in a situation in which there was no possible way for it to succeed. Its broadcast history is a Kobayashi Maru, aka a no-win situation. For one, it was bound to over 3 decades of established lore, which is fine if you're a sequel series, but it was set about 100 years before the events of the original series, which meant they not only had to be careful not to tread on established canon, but they also had to build their own story around stuff that had already existed. There was shit they couldn't simply ignore. The next thing working against it was the fact that by the time Enterprise premiered, Star Trek had been a regular fixture on television for the past 14 years. TNG, DS9, and Voyager all running through the 80s and into the early 2000s. And that's not even factoring in the movies either, which had been a regular fixture in theaters from 1979 until 2002. So you had a show that takes place 200 years in the past from the events of the most recent shows, 100 from the first show, based on a franchise that was experiencing brand fatigue. And to make matters much worse, the show premiered 2 weeks after 9/11. Yeah, for those who may be a little too young, 9/11 really did ruin everything. Like, most things that came out in 2001 are kind of forgotten because of 9/11. And this goes double for anything that came out, like, relatively close to when 9/11 happened. And honestly, all that other stuff working against it might have been something that it could have been able to push through, but the fact of the matter is, Enterprise was never really truly able to figure out what it wanted to do with itself. It didn't know if it wanted to be like a straight-up lore-fest prequel that kind of sets things up for the shows that already existed. It didn't know if it wanted to be its own thing that stood out. For every, like, relatively decent episode of Enterprise, there was a bunch of ones that just didn't land. But when Enterprise did something right, they did it right. And it makes me sad that because of all these factors, as well as the fact that the theme song was shit, that the show never really lived up to its true potential. As you notice, when I show the, like, title card, I'm not using that fucking Faith of the Heart song, because that song is ass. My dad dated this girl who would literally just mute the TV until the intro was done. But despite the stigma that Enterprise has, despite its detractors, despite the fact that everyone was fucking sick of Star Trek because Voyager presented a dumbed down and simplified version of the show, there do in fact exist some very good episodes of Enterprise. The major issue here is factoring in stuff that was established and popular in the more recent shows and trying to make it work in a show that takes place well before even the original series. Like, sometimes it not only doesn't work out, but it pisses the fans off. Case in point, that Ferengi episode. However, in some cases, you can totally take an idea that would piss off a fan base and actually make it work. One of the most fascinating episodes of Enterprise is Season 2's Regeneration, an episode that by all means should not work. An episode that feels like a horrible gimmick, a ratings grab. But because of some very good writing from the scriptwriters, they actually managed to make it work. See, the plot of Regeneration is that it features an encounter with the Borg. As we all know, first contact with the Borg didn't occur until Q-Who. So how the fuck does this work? Even the show's showrunner at the time, Brandon Braga, was staunchly against including the Borg in Enterprise as he felt it would come off as a cheap gimmick. And he's right to think that. The Borg have no place in a story that occurs before or even during the original series era. However, when he was presented with the treatment for Regeneration, he felt it was too clever to pass up. And in all honesty, despite going against continuity, they actually figured out how to make it work. The basic premise of Regeneration is that a research team in the Arctic comes across some frozen bodies in the ice, along with some fragments belonging to a ship of unknown origin. And it turns out that what they found in the ice were a couple of Borg that were actually blown out of space during the events of First Contact. They somehow managed to survive re-entry and ended up frozen in the Arctic for about a century. Right away, that is like going into the fucking lore bag and just like being like, yeah, what if we did this? Like, they cooked with this concept. It works perfectly. Like, there's nothing anybody can really contest about this. I'm not the biggest fan of First Contact, but I do think the Borg are pretty cool. The whole first act of this episode follows the research team as they examine these at the time unknown aliens. And as these aliens start to thaw out, they come back online, and the whole thing here just seems like a horror movie. It's got some aspects of John Carpenter's The Thing, what with the Arctic isolated setting, but it also kind of just like, it just feels like a horror movie. And when Star Trek does horror, they do it relatively well. It's one of those stories where it's like, we know what's going on and what's going to happen, but the research team has no fucking idea. Where you're just like, don't do it, and then they do it.
There's no reason to assume they're hostile. A few moments later.
Get me a medical kit.
And of course, in true horror movie fashion, it all goes to shit. The Enterprise ends up getting called in to chase down the transport ship that was stolen by the unknown aliens, with the impression that the research team was taken hostage. It's essentially a search and rescue type story. But since it's the Borg, and since they're about like 200 years in the past, where like even in modern times the Federation has trouble dealing with the Borg, there's a lot of stakes here. And there's a whole element of danger because the Borg are multiplying. They assault a Tarkalian freighter and assimilate some of the inhabitants, and Archer accidentally brings 2 survivors aboard. And since they've been infected, they start to run amok, infecting Dr. Phlox. Now this is something I'm going to touch more on when I do like more episodes of Enterprise that are actually like kind of story-based. This is definitely more of a Monster of the Week type story, but the characters in Enterprise are actually pretty solid, and I like Dr. Phlox a lot. I like most of the characters on this show, even Hoshi, who really doesn't get to do anything most of the time. What makes Phlox interesting is that he's not like McCoy, where he's always like, "God damn it, you motherfucker!" And he's not like Crusher, who's all like, "Oh, John Luke, stick it in my..." He's eccentric to the point where you might think he's like a mad doctor, but Phlox is a solid guy. And the Denobulans are interesting aliens in general, and we get to learn a little bit more about their biology, how they have very strong immune systems, something Phlox is going to need if he's going to work out a cure for the nanoprobe infection. So there's a sense of urgency now with the B-plot. While Regeneration does have some good character moments, once again, this is an episode about the Borg, and Starfleet's chronological first contact with them. One of the biggest complaints about the Borg and how their arc went is essentially like they were too powerful for the story's own good. When the Borg were introduced in TNG, they were posed as this huge threat to the Federation. Adaptable, unstoppable, and very technologically advanced. They even assimilated Captain Picard in the legendary TNG two-parter Best of Both Worlds. In their first major confrontation, the Federation only just barely prevented the Borg from assimilating Earth. To show how seriously fucking tough the Borg were, not only did they get their own movie, but in the episode Parallels, we actually get to see a timeline where the Borg won at Wolf 359 and took over the Federation. The problem with a race this powerful is you have to use them very sparingly. As such, they only ever made 6 appearances in TNG, and of course were the focal point of the movie First Contact, as I mentioned. So Regeneration is both a prequel and a sequel to First Contact. Nevertheless, like, it got really hard to use the Borg because, again, it's like they're super powerful, but if we keep giving the protagonist ways to beat them, they're not going to come off as very powerful anymore. Initially, the Borg were supposed to be the major antagonists of Deep Space Nine, but as I mentioned, if they kept using the Borg, it would kill off their appeal. They'd be like, well, they'd be losing all the time because we can't just have them kill everybody. In the lore of Star Trek, the Borg is the biggest threat the Federation has ever faced, and they chose not to make them the major antagonists of Deep Space Nine so as not to diminish their threat level. Instead, Deep Space Nine used the Cardassians and later the Dominion as their main antagonists. And then we get to Voyager. Now, Voyager took place in the Delta Quadrant, which is the home quadrant for the Borg, and while they did do a pretty good job holding off on featuring them, by the 4th season, when the ship entered Borg territory, the Borg became a somewhat regular threat in Voyager. To put this into perspective, when comparing Borg appearances across all the live-action shows, including Picard, TNG, Deep Space Nine, Enterprise, and Picard have a total of 22 Borg appearances. Voyager beats that out by 1. They had 23 Borg appearances. That is like entirely too many appearances for the Borg. They even had a Borg cast member join the crew. The main complaint, though, about the Borg's overuse in Voyager is that it kinda led to them being nerfed, and they were reduced from a galactic-level threat to kind of a joke. You expect me to believe that Captain Let's Fucking Kill Tuvik's Janeway could defeat the Borg 23 times? What Regeneration does for the Borg is it makes them as threatening as they were in their first appearance in Q-Who. If anything, they're even more of a threat because we've taken away the modern developments against them and we've pitted them against the much more low-tech Enterprise NX crew. It's built up perfectly in the first act because Archer and the NX have no real idea what they're up against, but we know what they're up against. And it's interesting to see Captain Archer approach this. Captain Archer isn't my favorite captain, but I do think he's a solid character. He's kind of a weird combination of Kirk and Picard. He's got that bravado like Kirk, but he does have a Picard-like demeanor. He always tries to do the right thing, he always tries to avoid violence, and his main concern in this episode is returning the captured crew members home. It's a pretty solid display of character that he basically insists that they help the Tarkalians that were attacked by the Borg earlier, even when it does kind of blow up in his face. And even when it does blow up in his face, when the Tarkalians are shown to be hostile and start damaging the ship's systems with their nanotech, it's not easy for Archer to just blow them out of the airlock. He does show like some resistance on it. He really doesn't want to do it, but he only does it when he has no choice.
The junction's empty.
Close the hatch and repressurize.
You had no choice.
This little exchange is pretty solid. Like, a lot of the whole thing with Enterprise is that T'Pol is a Vulcan who's on board the ship. She's not like a half-breed like Spock. Like, she's full-blooded. She represses her emotions. She is completely bound to logic. But when Archer makes the hard decision to jettison the two Tarkalian Borgs, like, you can tell T'Pol doesn't really, like, feel what he's feeling, but she does kind of empathize with him. If it were her in charge, she would have done it no questions asked, but having been around Captain Archer and kind of starting to understand him, she does offer kind of some reassurance that he had no other choice. You can tell in her own Vulcan way that she does kind of feel bad for him, because she understands that he's not happy about it. The interesting thing though about T'Pol is that she was actually going to be revealed to be half Romulan later on had the show been renewed for a 5th season. But nevertheless, throughout the course of Enterprise, she does kind of gain a human touch. T'Pol is a solid character too, and it's not just because Jolene Balak is fucking hot as shit. She is, like, she's gorgeous, but she is a good character. We get some cute interactions with Phlox and Hoshi, Trip works his magic to get rid of all the Borg tech, and Reed devises a way to power up the primitive phase pistols so that they could actually damage the Borg through their shield. Also, funny little first contact reference.
That shielding of theirs was impressive. They might as well have been firing holographic bullets.
I do really enjoy the suspense that Regeneration builds because, yeah, you know at the end of the day the Enterprise is going to come out on top because if they all got assimilated there wouldn't be a show. But Reed and Archer going into the Borg-infested ship to blow out a vital part of it with an explosive device is a bit hectic and filled with tension. It's creepy watching them go through the hive. Like, this is how you use the Borg, by the way. Like, the Borg should be always like a horror threat. And to kind of follow up on what happened with the Tarkalians, Archer basically just has to accept the fact that the research team is gone and them simply blowing up the ship is an act of mercy. It's satisfying that they come out on top at the end, but it's a bit of a downer ending. But hey, at least Phlox cured himself, yay.
Did you find the research team?
There isn't anyone on that ship we can help anymore. Target their warp core. Hit them with everything we've got.
And it wouldn't be an Enterprise episode if they didn't directly reference something in one of the shows that takes place in the future. Explaining that while the Borg were under attack, they sent out a transmission to the Delta Quadrant. But of course they don't have to worry about that for another 200 years. Regeneration does a great job of introducing an element that shouldn't be an Enterprise into Enterprise. It's not an outstanding episode by any means, but it is genuinely entertaining and it's a decent watch. It's a solid Monster of the Week episode using our favorite cybernetic zombies from Star Trek. Returned the Borg to form, it made a genuinely decent horror-adjacent Star Trek episode, and it's certainly one of the better episodes from Enterprise's 2nd season, which is overall considered to be its worst season. Now, I did mention earlier that T'Pol was to be revealed to be half Romulan in the cancelled Season 5 of Enterprise, which is something that's going to come up somewhat frequently whenever I do Enterprise episodes. But what if I told you that Regeneration was actually supposed to get a follow-up episode in that season, which would have featured Borg Queen actress Alice Kurge as a Starfleet communications officer. We're going to go into the whole origin of the Borg Queen by having her receive a Borg transmission. Sadly, there aren't a whole bunch of details on what the proposed Regeneration sequel would have had happen besides what I just mentioned, because sadly the show got cancelled after season 4. Now, if I had to rate Regeneration on a scale of 1 to 10, I would give it a solid 6.5 out of 10. It's a solid watch, nothing overly positive to say about the episode, but there are no real negatives to the episode. Not every good episode of Star Trek has to be like like In Purgatory's Shadow, or City on the Edge of Forever, or Measure of a Man. Sometimes there's just like a good episode that's like something you'd catch on TV and you'll be like, alright, let's watch this. It's like, yeah, that was pretty good. It is the best way to do an episode that takes something established in a fictional show's future and set it in the past. Honestly, the general idea of following up a movie as a TV episode is pretty solid. I would argue I'm more entertained by Regeneration than I was with First Contact because I really don't like First Contact that much. Some of the criticism of this episode is actually that the first act in the Arctic didn't go on long enough, and honestly I kind of agree with that. I think if they did a 50-50 split where it's like we get to see like each of the research team getting like assimilated and trying to fight back, would have actually brought this episode's score up a bit. Definitely could have done a lot more with that, but whatever the case, this is what we got. Even with that minor complaint, the flaws in this episode are minimal. It has a slow pace in the middle, but the score, the design, and the overall presentation of the Borg as a threat are all solid. It's definitely an episode that I would recommend if you're like kind of going through more of the better received episodes that are a bit more heavy and you need a bit of a breather. It's a good breather episode. That's exactly what Regeneration is. It's actionized, it's got the horror, it's not really weighing on the overall arc of Enterprise, but it keeps your attention. What are your thoughts on Regeneration? Let me know in the comments, and feel free to like, subscribe, and comment, and I'll see you next time.
You will be assimilated. Resistance is futile.